They said the house was quiet that morning. Too quiet for a place that once pulsed with the rhythm of servants' footsteps and the clinking of fine silver. The door to the master's chamber was locked from within. It took 3 men to break it open. What they found on the other side was not simply a crime scene. It was a message, written in blood and silence. Colonel Augustus Van Dorn sat upright at his table, eyes open, skin gray as marble, a fork still in his hand. Before him a silver platter. Upon it, something so blasphemous that the coroner's report, sealed by order of the legislature, was never meant to be read by mortal eyes. He'd been dead 3 days, and beside him knelt an old woman in servant's garb, lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Her name was Dinah Colebrook. She had served him for 30 years. When they tried to move her, she spoke just 7 words. Words that would echo through Charleston's buried archives like a curse. I served him faithful, 30 years faithful. They said her tone wasn't remorse. It wasn't madness either. It was completion, like a vow fulfilled. But here's the part they never told you. The body on the floor was not the first casualty of Bellwood Manor. That house had been eating people for decades. Not through ghosts or demons, but through something older. Something built into the bones of power itself. Because Bellwood wasn't just a plantation, it was a machine. A mechanism designed to break wills, extract loyalty, and feed on obedience. And Dinah, child of that system, wasn't its victim. She was its final engineer. What you're about to hear isn't just a story of vengeance. It's the anatomy of submission. How a mind can be conditioned for decades to kneel, until the day it learns that obedience itself is a weapon. You've been taught to think of loyalty as virtue. But what happens when loyalty becomes a curse? When the one who serves begins to see the truth, that every command, every order, every act of faithfulness is a form of sorcery, binding the soul through repetition and fear. History erased her name. The church silenced the testimonies. The state sealed the evidence, but some things can't be buried. Because every man who's ever bowed to another carries a little of Dinah's secret inside him. And tonight, you'll learn what she finally served. Before the screams and the silver platter, there was the promise. It was made in a room lit by 1 candle, when Dinah was no more than 8 years old. Small enough to be invisible, old enough to understand she was property. They called it an oath of service, but what happened that night inside Bellwood Manor was closer to initiation. The mistress, Constance Van Dorn, had taken the child by the wrist, pricked her thumb with a sewing needle, and pressed it to parchment beside her own signature, a child's blood marking the bottom of a contract she could not read. Augustus Van Dorn looked on from the shadows, smiling as though the ceremony amused him. He said words that history forgot, words meant to sound Christian, but borrowed from something far older. The servants whispered afterward that the master's family had brought strange rites from Europe. Rituals to ensure loyalty, to bind the spirit to the house itself. No one questioned it. In the Low Country, oaths were as common as graves. For 3 decades, that oath held Dinah like a chain she couldn't see. She rose before dawn, slept long after midnight, learned every crack in the manor's floorboards. Her entire life became a rhythm of obedience, a pattern repeated until it carved grooves into her mind. That's how control works. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It rewards compliance until you begin to crave it. And soon the cage no longer needs walls. The mind polices itself. They trained her to believe that service was holiness, that her purpose was to absorb cruelty with grace. She watched Constance vanish behind silks and bruises, her kindness crushed by a husband who believed ownership was divine right. Yet through the horror, Dinah's eyes stayed open. Every command she obeyed, every humiliation she endured, became data, a study in the anatomy of power. Most men in Charleston thought control came from the whip or the law, but Dinah learned the deeper truth: real control is psychological. It's repetition. It's ritual. It's a phrase said often enough that it becomes the architecture of your reality. The master says, "You belong to me," and one day, you repeat it to yourself without realizing, and that's why what happened 30 years later wasn't madness. It was mathematics, the equation of power, inverted. The servant who had been trained to serve discovered the hidden variable. That obedience, taken to its purest form, becomes indistinguishable from possession, and once you understand possession, you can turn it back on the master. The oath was never written in the Bible, though they made her swear upon it, hidden in the family ledgers, beneath columns of rice yields and slave inventories, were pages of older writing. Latin, Flemish, something that even the clerks who managed the accounts didn't recognize. Constance once told Dinah, in a half-dreamed confession, that her husband's ancestors were not planters at all, but custodians of an older covenant. When Charleston was still marshland and Spanish moss, when the colonies were dreams scribbled on parchment, the Van Dorns had already begun collecting souls through contracts of service, their lineage traced back to Dutch merchants who trafficked in something rarer than spices or gold. Obedience itself, they believed human will could be refined, distilled, transformed into energy. The plantation was just an altar disguised as enterprise. Every order obeyed, every punishment accepted, was a small offering to the machinery of hierarchy. Augustus understood that system perfectly. He didn't see cruelty as vice, he saw it as fuel. The more despair he created, the stronger his sense of control became. He spoke often of divine order, but what he worshipped was structure. The illusion that one man's will could override another's soul, and Dinah, caught in that lattice of domination, learned its language from the inside. She saw how the house itself seemed to hum at night, how the air thickened when Augustus prayed in his private study. Reciting words not found in any church hymnal, he called those moments alignment. To him, control wasn't evil, it was sacred architecture. To rule was to participate in God's design. To be ruled was to accept one's ordained place. That was his gospel. But Dinah began to notice patterns. The master's strength wasn't constant. On certain nights, after his rituals, he seemed diminished, as if the act of control drained something from him. Servants whispered that the walls bled sap, that mirrors clouded when he spoke the old names. Dinah didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in systems, and every system has a flaw. She began copying fragments of his private books onto scraps of cloth, sewing them into her mattress. The symbols repeated. Loops, crosses, spirals, sigils of submission. What he used to bind others could, in theory, be reversed. She began to wonder if that was the true heresy of Bellwood, that obedience, taken past its limit, could become mastery. The system that fed on loyalty might one day consume itself. At first, Dinah didn't understand the power she was touching. She thought she was simply collecting knowledge. Scribbles from forbidden books, strange symbols the master used in his prayers. But knowledge has weight, and the mind that carries it begins to change shape beneath it. She started small. When Augustus ordered her to do something, she repeated the command silently, word for word, before obeying. She noticed something strange. The moment she repeated it internally, his tone shifted. His dominance seemed to falter for a heartbeat, as if the words bounced back toward him. Power, she realized, wasn't in the command itself. It was in the acceptance. When she echoed his voice within her own mind, she mirrored his control, split it, and for that instant, the energy looped between them. That was how Dinah began to study the mechanics of obedience. Each order became an experiment. Every, "Yes, master," was a line of code, rewritten in secret. What he thought was submission was actually inversion, a slow hijacking of intention. When he demanded silence, she listened deeper. When he forced pain, she memorized its rhythm, dissected the anatomy of fear until it no longer belonged to her. Obedience became her disguise, her camouflage. And under that mask, something ancient began to awaken. In the still hours of night, she sat at her small window, drawing the sigils in water on the wooden floor, shapes that dissolved by dawn. Spirals, loops, mirrors of power. She whispered the phrases she'd heard Augustus use, reversing them, breaking them down syllable by syllable, until they lost their command. The air in her room grew heavy. Sometimes the candles flickered blue. She did not pray, she studied. She dissected control itself the way a scientist dissects the body. Coldly, methodically, without mercy, and she started noticing patterns beyond Bellwood. The church sermons, the plantation rules, the laws written by men who called themselves civilized, they all echoed the same formula. Speak authority. Repeat submission. Reinforce hierarchy. It wasn't just one house. It was the entire civilization feeding on human obedience. Dinah began to understand that what the Van Dorns called divine order was the real disease. The plantation was a model of the world, and every man, white or black, master or slave, was caught inside its geometry. The only way out was inversion, and one day she would find the word that turned the structure inside out. It began with small disturbances, the kind polite society would never notice, but servants always feel in their bones. The air in Bellwood thickened after dusk, heavy with something unspoken. Candles guttered for no reason. Dogs refused to approach the manor steps. The other servants whispered that the house had turned against its master. Dinah said nothing, but she watched. She watched how Augustus's hands trembled when he gave orders. She saw the flicker in his eyes when she answered, "Yes, master," a fraction too late, just enough to interrupt his rhythm, to fracture the chain of command. Power thrives on pattern, break the pattern, and the spell weakens. The old man didn't understand what was happening to him. He thought it was age, fatigue, perhaps guilt gnawing at his heart like a hidden parasite. But Dinah knew. She'd found the fracture point. Every command he gave became an opportunity to reverse current, to feed the energy back through the system until the source began to decay. She wasn't poisoning his food. She was poisoning his authority. Slowly, invisibly, with the same patience he had once used to break others. One night, as she served him wine, he looked at her and faltered mid-sentence. His voice caught, just slightly, as though he'd forgotten his own name. It lasted only a moment, but she saw the confusion flicker like lightning across his face. For the first time in his life, he was unsure. She felt it like a pulse in her chest. That was the proof she needed. The power had begun to shift. Her experiments grew bolder. She whispered counter, phrases beneath her breath while cleaning his study, threading her voice into the spaces between his words. She'd learned that control required repetition to survive. So she replaced it, word by word, with silence. He'd say, "Serve," and she'd think, "Mirror." He'd say, "Obey," and she'd think, "Observe." Language itself became her weapon. And then came the dreams. Each night, she saw the same vision: Bellwood burning, the master's mouth sewn shut, and herself standing over the ashes holding not chains, but keys. She'd wake before dawn drenched in sweat, trembling, but never afraid. Because now, Dinah understood the truth: the same system that enslaves can be inverted to enslave its creator. Every empire, every hierarchy, carries within it the seed of its own destruction. The servant who learns how the ritual works. By the winter of 1846, the master of Bellwood Manor had begun to rot from the inside out. His physicians called it nervous exhaustion. But the symptoms were older than medicine. He forgot words mid-sentence. He'd stand at the head of his grand dining table, staring at the silverware as if it were written in a language he no longer understood. At night, the servants heard him pacing his study, muttering fragments of scripture that didn't exist. He'd fall silent for hours, then scream as if struck by something unseen. The house responded like a living thing, floorboards swelling, walls whispering. Power was unraveling, and it made noise when it died. The Charleston elite came calling, offering prayers, remedies, and gossip disguised as sympathy. Behind their polite concern lay fear. Bellwood had always been a symbol of order, the perfect plantation, the divine hierarchy made flesh. And now, that symbol was sick. If Augustus Van Dorn could decay, what did that mean for all the men who mirrored him? What did it say about the entire system that fed on loyalty and submission? Dinah moved through it all in silence. She served him still, every day, never breaking her role. But the energy had shifted completely. When she entered a room, he flinched. When she spoke, his eyes darted away, as if he feared her voice might contain a curse. In truth, she had already spoken it. Every gesture, every quiet glance, every unspoken word was part of her invocation. She had become the mirror of his will, reflecting his control back upon him, until his own authority consumed itself. Some nights she'd hear him praying to the walls, begging the unseen forces he once commanded to return. "I am the master," he whispered. "I am the order." But the house no longer listened. Bellwood had a new pulse now, one that beat in time with Dinah's breath. The once invisible servant had become the architecture itself, the still, silent eye within the collapsing system. And when the sickness finally turned physical, when his flesh began to sag, his heart stuttered, his mind frayed, she understood it wasn't poison. It was consequence. Every command, every cruelty, every prayer for dominance had circled back like a snake swallowing its own tail. He had built his kingdom on control. Dinah had simply taught it to remember who was feeding it. By spring, Bellwood had become a rumor wrapped in silence. Ministers whispered of hauntings. Neighbors crossed themselves when passing the estate's iron gates. The Van Dorn lineage, once praised as Charleston's moral foundation, was now spoken of only behind closed doors. They said the Colonel's mind had gone, that he'd begun sealing mirrors with cloth, claiming the reflections were watching him, that he refused to eat unless Dinah herself prepared the meal. Some said he'd stopped sleeping altogether, terrified of what waited behind his eyelids. But what none of them knew was that the exorcism had already begun, and Dinah was the one performing it. It started the night she found him weeping in the library. Surrounded by books, he could no longer read. The candles sputtered and died as she entered. He looked up, eyes hollow, voice cracking. "Something's wrong with this house," he whispered. She didn't answer. She simply walked to the fireplace, took one of his books, and threw it into the flames. The pages curled and blackened, releasing a smell like sweet rot. "The house is fine," she said softly. "It's only remembering what you made it forget." After that, he refused the city's doctors and priests, convinced they were part of the conspiracy he could no longer name. But the church could not ignore the scandal. Reverend Pritchard himself, kin to Constance's bloodline, came with a retinue of deacons, carrying crosses and psalms. They entered Bellwood at dusk, chanting their authority into the corridors. Yet as they prayed, their voices faltered. One by one, they fell silent. The air turned thick, metallic. The Reverend claimed later that the house breathed. When they reached the dining hall, every candle went out at once. In that blackness, someone heard a whisper, female, steady, commanding, "This place already has a god." They fled before dawn. The Reverend was found the next morning, clutching his Bible upside down, pages torn. He never preached again. From that night forward, no outsider stepped inside Bellwood. It belonged to Dinah now, though no one dared say it aloud. The servants obeyed her without question, sensing in her something beyond human. Her silence became law, her presence ritual. She had inverted the order completely, without raising a hand, without spilling blood. But the inversion wasn't yet complete. For the system to collapse, one final act remained, the feast. The night of the feast came without announcement. There were no invitations, no guests in silk or lace. Only the remaining house servants, gathered by Dinah's quiet command, and the master himself. frail, trembling, wrapped in a wool blanket though the air was warm. The dining hall glowed dimly under candlelight. The long mahogany table, once crowded with Charleston's proudest names, was stripped bare except for 7 simple bowls. Each held a portion of rice, salted water, and bitter herbs, the same meal once served to the enslaved on Sundays. The reversal had begun. Augustus stared at the arrangement with confusion that curdled into rage. "What mockery is this?" he rasped. "Do you think hunger is holy?" Dinah didn't answer. She stood at the head of the table where he once presided, her posture calm, her gaze steady. "This is remembrance," she said, "and remembrance is the only prayer that still works." When he tried to rise, his knees failed. The servants did not move to help him. The hierarchy that had once been reflex now lay shattered, replaced by something older, reciprocal, electric, wordless. Dinah began to speak then, not in English, but in the broken cadences of the Van Dorn sigils. The language she had spent years unweaving and rewriting, the syllables carried through the air like a slow vibration. The candles bent inward, their flames drawn toward her voice. She had rewritten the geometry of command into something new, reflection. What was once vertical, master above, servant below, became circular, a system eating its own history. As she spoke, Augustus's body began to stiffen. His breath came in ragged gasps. He reached for her, but his hand froze mid-air, suspended between plea and accusation. "You can't," he whispered. "You belong to me." Dinah leaned forward, her voice soft as a benediction. "No," she said. "I belong to the balance you broke." When she finished the incantation, the silence that followed was immense. The candles went out one by one, until only the moonlight remained. Augustus collapsed, eyes open but unseeing. The servants didn't scream, they only bowed their heads, as if a long drought had finally broken. By dawn, the house was still. The master's body was gone, some said swallowed by the earth beneath the foundation. And Dinah, she walked out through the front doors barefoot, carrying nothing. The house no longer held her. Charleston awoke to whispers. No one saw the master's burial, yet everyone claimed to know where he lay. Some said the earth behind Bellwood cracked open and swallowed him whole. Others swore his spirit wandered the marshes, calling for the woman who'd unmade him. But Dinah's name was never spoken aloud. In polite company, they called her the woman from the house, as if naming her might summon the same fate that had taken Bellwood's last heir. Within weeks, the estate was abandoned. The overseers fled first, then the house servants, leaving furniture half-shrouded, mirrors still covered, yet no one dared strip the place. Slaves freed by inheritance laws refused to enter, saying the land itself was awake. Crows gathered on the chimneys, silent and watching. At night, the glow of candles was seen through upper windows, though no human lived inside. Bellwood had become a breathing wound on Charleston's edge. Half memory, half warning. But stories, like seeds, travel farther than the soil that births them. Dinah's legend spread among the quarters and markets, from field to dock. They said she spoke the true name of power, that she turned obedience into language, and language into freedom. Women recited fragments of her supposed prayers before childbirth. Men carried charms carved with the shape of her sigil, a spiral closing upon itself, then opening again. The city's preachers denounced it as devilry, yet they avoided her name even in condemnation. Years passed. The war came and burned through the Carolinas, but Bellwood stood untouched, its fields overgrown, its gates sealed by superstition. After emancipation, freed families settled nearby and called the region Dinah's Parish. They claimed her presence protected them from the worst of the soldiers' raids. Children were told that if they disobeyed cruel masters, Dinah would stand beside them unseen, whispering courage in their ear. In time, historians erased her from the records. The Van Dorns became a footnote, their ledgers lost in courthouse fires. Only oral memory kept her alive, voice to voice, story to story. a woman who had spoken the empire backward. And on certain nights, when the wind moved through the Spanish moss, travelers said they could hear her humming from the ruins. A low, steady sound, neither mourning nor triumph, but balance itself. The first time Dr. Miriam Holt saw Bellwood, it was little more than a skeleton of brick and ivy. The roof had caved in decades ago, the porch swallowed by vines, yet the air around it felt unnaturally still, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. She had come not for ghosts, but for documents, fragments of plantation ledgers rumored to survive in the cellar, sealed by humidity and time. The grant she'd received from the University of South Carolina listed her project as economic archaeology. What she didn't write in the proposal was what truly drew her there. The name she'd found scratched in a 19th century court record. Dinah, house servant, unaccounted for. She'd studied hundreds of plantations, but this one was different. The Van Dorn archives were blank where there should have been decades of entries. Crops listed without workers, transactions with no signatures. A void in the paper trail that felt deliberate, like a wound someone had tried to cauterize. Bellwood wasn't forgotten, it had been erased. The deeper Miriam dug, the stranger the silences became. Her assistant found carved symbols in the foundation stones, loops, spirals, patterns repeating at perfect intervals. Not decorative, intentional. One matched an illustration she'd seen in a fragment of African cosmograms from the Congo Basin. Another mirrored a glyph from early Dutch alchemical manuscripts. How those two traditions had met in this soil was a question no archive could answer. At night, in her rented cottage nearby, she played the field recordings she'd made inside the ruin. Between the wind and the creak of floorboards, there were faint harmonics, tones too regular to be coincidence. When she slowed the playback, the rhythm resembled a human hum, 3 rising notes, then a pause. The same sequence repeated every few minutes, always from the same spot, the former dining hall. By the 3rd week, Miriam stopped dismissing her unease as fatigue. The data she collected, sound waves, electromagnetic readings, temperature anomalies, suggested a pattern centered exactly where the master's chair once stood. She began to wonder whether Dinah's legend was more than myth. If the inversion Bellwood was built upon still lingered, an architecture of will embedded in the earth itself. And when the humming started to answer her, softly, distinctly, in rhythm with her own heartbeat, Miriam realized she wasn't excavating history anymore. History was excavating her. By the 4th week, Dr. Miriam Holt no longer trusted her instruments or her sleep. The data kept shifting. Her magnetometer spiked every time she entered the dining hall, but only when she was alone. The recorder she left overnight captured sounds like breathing, a low vibration that rose and fell with the rhythm of her pulse. At first, she thought it was interference from the marsh. Then one night, she whispered Dinah's name aloud, and the frequency doubled. That was the moment she stopped thinking of Bellwood as ruin and started thinking of it as an organism. The cellar proved most revealing. Beneath a layer of collapsed plaster, Miriam's trowel hit something not stone, but metal. A rusted bowl filled with ash and small bone fragments. Around it, someone had etched symbols into the foundation. Shallow but deliberate spirals intersecting loops, closed circles bleeding into open ones. She recognized the same geometry she'd seen in the Van Dorn ledgers, the same inverted sigils Dinah had sewn into her mattress a century and a half ago. The inversion was literal, etched upside down, as if meant to bind rather than summon. That night, the storm came. Wind tore through the live oaks, rattling the shutters of her cottage. Power flickered. Miriam lay awake, notebook open, listening to the rain. Somewhere between the thunderclaps, she heard it again, humming, faint but precise, emerging not from outside, but from the recorder on her desk. She hadn't pressed play. The sound swelled, 3 rising notes, then a pause. Mimicry, she whispered, and the word came back, soft, delayed, like an echo with intent. The next morning, she returned to Bellwood to find footprints in the dust. Bare feet. Small, narrow, leading from the dining hall to the cellar stairs. She followed them down, every nerve tight with anticipation. The bowl of ash was gone. In its place lay a piece of linen, half decayed but unmistakable, stitched with the spiral and loop symbol in black thread. Beneath it, scrawled in soot, a single line, "Remember what was unmade." Her hands trembled as she traced the letters. The air was warm, pulsing. For the first time, Miriam understood the warning embedded in every oral story. Every legend of Bellwood Dinah hadn't destroyed the system. She had reversed it, turned it outward, and anyone who looked too long into its mirror became part of its reflection. Miriam began dreaming in another woman's memory. The first time, she woke in darkness, the scent of wood smoke and lye in her lungs. Her hands, no, Dinah's hands, were pressing linen into a basin of water blackened with ash. Somewhere above, a man was shouting, a voice like thunder cracking through the walls. When she looked down, she saw words stitched into the cloth she was washing. Loops, spirals, the same sigils she had uncovered in the cellar. Then, in the dream, the water rippled as if answering her heartbeat. She woke gasping, her palms wet, her pillow stained faintly with soot. The next day, she refused to sleep. She pored over her notes, cross-referencing plantation accounts, Dutch grimoires, and Congo cosmograms until the boundary between them dissolved. It was all one grammar, she realized. Different dialects of control and reversal. Bellwood wasn't just a plantation, it was a circuit, a machine for transmuting obedience into will. Dinah hadn't destroyed it. She had rewritten it, hardwired it into the soil itself. At dusk, Miriam returned to the dining hall, driven by a pull she couldn't name. The air shimmered faintly, as if light were bending around an invisible shape. On the floor, where the master's chair once stood, the pattern of sigils had reappeared, etched into dust that hadn't been there yesterday. She knelt, tracing them. The moment her fingers touched the central spiral, the humming began again, louder now, resonating through her ribs. "Miriam," the voice whispered, not through her ears, but from within the vibration itself. She didn't recoil. She understood. This was no haunting, it was inheritance. The resonance wasn't possessing her. It was remembering through her. The structure Dinah built had always needed a witness, a body through which it could re-articulate itself, each generation. Bellwood wasn't decaying, it was rewriting, waiting for the next articulation of balance. As the sound grew, the floor beneath her seemed to breathe. She felt her pulse align with the rhythm of the house, each beat a translation of Dinah's final invocation: reversal, reflection, return. By the time Miriam rose, the candles had reignited on their own. She no longer felt alone. The boundaries between observer and subject, scholar and spirit, had vanished. In her notebook, she wrote the last line she would ever sign under her own name. The study continues. The house remembers. By the third night, Miriam stopped trying to leave Bellwood. The air outside the manor had grown thick, like breathing through syrup. Every path she took circled her back to the same oak-lined road, the same rusted gate that never quite opened. She no longer felt trapped, though. The house wasn't holding her hostage. It was teaching her. Each creak of the boards, each flicker of the lanterns in the hall, seemed to pulse with syllables, as though language itself were embedded in the architecture. She began to hear them clearly on the fourth day, not voices exactly, more like a chorus of layered whispers slipping through the cracks of her perception. Some were pleading, some instructive. One sounded like Dinah, the tone neither kind nor cruel, but authoritative, commanding her attention. What was taken must be returned, it said. What was hidden must speak. Miriam stood before the long dining table, the same table where Van Dorn had been found with that silver platter 3 centuries ago. The surface was gouged, scarred, its polish long gone, but beneath the grime, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Faint grooves, shallow cuts forming a circular pattern. She fetched a candle and tilted it low. There they were again, the symbols, carved directly into the oak, arranged like a clock face around a central spiral. In her dreams, Dinah had washed linen stained with blood. Now, Miriam realized those stains had been ink. The cloth wasn't for cleaning, it was for binding. Each symbol represented a transfer of intent, the conversion of obedience into command. Dinah hadn't poisoned her master to kill him. She had inverted their covenant. What had been domination became devotion, flipped like a mirror. The act was not revenge, it was reclamation. Miriam pressed her palm to the spiral. The air vibrated. She saw flashes: Dinah kneeling beside the dead man, whispering words that burned the air, Constance lying motionless, her body no longer broken but serene, the walls absorbing the sound of a single command: remember. And then Miriam spoke aloud, though the words weren't hers. Every system of power carries its own undoing in its reflection. The candles flared. Her shadow stretched across the walls, taller than she should have been, its outline not quite human. Bellwood sighed like something waking from a long dream. That night, the house spoke in patterns of light. Not words, never words, but pulses, glimmers running through the cracks of the walls like veins filled with molten memory. Miriam followed the rhythm through the corridors, barefoot, eyes wide open, though the world had tilted into something unrecognizable. Each doorway whispered something different, phrases that vibrated in the air but never reached the ear. The library called to her most clearly. She entered. The books had rearranged themselves. Rows that had once stood in perfect order now formed a spiral from floor to ceiling, the same geometry carved into the dining table. Dust rose in spiraling motes, catching candlelight like static. At the center of the spiral sat a single open volume, a ledger she had catalogued days before. But its ink had changed. The neat accounting columns were now filled with names, hundreds of them, written in two hands. One unmistakably belonged to Dinah. The other, heavier, more angular, Van Dorn's. Each name paired servant and master, wife and husband, oppressor and oppressed. Miriam realized the list wasn't archival. It was contractual. A map of human ownership, but inverted through Dinah's markings. Every name she had touched had been rewritten, unbound, claimed back into balance. She felt a tremor in her chest. Terror, awe, belonging. The house darkened. Behind her, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, not human. When she turned, the air behind her shimmered, folding inward like heat. And then, out of that distortion, shapes emerged, silhouettes of those who had lived and died within Bellwood's walls, not ghosts, echoes of transaction. Dinah stood at their head, her eyes bright as furnace light. "You have heard," she said. "Now you must answer." Miriam stepped closer, heart hammering. "What do you want from me?" Dinah's smile was both mercy and command. Continuity. "The system doesn't end. It transforms. You are its mirror." The chorus behind her spoke as one, a sound like wind over water. "Complete the reversal." Miriam felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing into her spine. She understood what it meant. To break the loop, she had to seal it, consciously, willingly. Every act of domination would be recorded, inverted, and remembered through her. Her pulse slowed. She nodded once. "Then teach me." The light returned, brighter, almost blinding. The spiral turned inside her. By dawn, Bellwood had changed shape. The architecture itself seemed to breathe, walls flexing subtly, boards groaning in long, rhythmic pulses that mirrored Miriam's heartbeat. Dust drifted upward, not down, and light filtered through the windows as though the sun had been rerouted. Every surface carried a faint sheen, as if the house had been anointed. Miriam moved through it in silence, her mind neither dreaming nor awake, but somewhere in between. She stopped in the dining room. The spiral was back, glowing faintly beneath the table's ruined surface. The sigils burned like embers trapped beneath varnish. Her body responded instinctively, lowering to her knees, tracing each symbol with a trembling finger. The air thickened, heavy, electric. She could feel her there again. Dinah. The voice arrived as vibration deep in Miriam's bones. You must understand what you inherit, it said. This was never vengeance. It was design. And then the house showed her. Images, sounds, sensations, all overlaid like memories bleeding through glass. Dinah kneeling before the dying colonel, not in servitude but ceremony, her hands steady, her expression neither hateful nor joyous, just resolved. The silver platter between them gleamed like a mirror. Inside it, a reflection shifted not the master's face, but Constance's, peaceful at last. Dinah whispered, equilibrium restored. The vision fractured into layers of time. Each generation that lived within Bellwood reenacted the pattern unconsciously. Power rising, corruption blooming, reversal inevitable, a self-correcting mechanism disguised as tragedy. That was the secret buried under every ledger, every sermon, every law. The system didn't fear rebellion. It relied on it to cleanse itself. Miriam's breath came shallow. She saw modern faces now. Corporate suits, polished boardrooms, news anchors smiling through deception. The same geometry of power, just refined. Bellwood had been a prototype, a small-scale ritual of governance. Dinah had understood what most philosophers only guessed: every hierarchy is a spell, and every spell consumes its caster. When the vision ended, Miriam was lying flat against the floorboards, her palms burning with imprinted symbols. The house was utterly still. In the quiet, she whispered to no one, I see now. Somewhere in the rafters, wood cracked like distant applause. Halfway through the transformation, her voice shifted from awe to command. If you understand, she murmured to the unseen listeners, comment below, the mirror remembers. Say it twice, to awaken what watches. Miriam sat where the first light hit the dining room floor. For the first time in days, the air around her didn't hum. It listened. She whispered the phrase again, testing its shape. It was only sound, yet it made the candle flames bend toward her, as if gravity had changed direction. She realized that everything Dinah had built worked through resonance, not superstition. Words were frequencies. Belief was an amplifier. The notebook she had carried since the start lay open beside her. Half the pages were blank. She began to write, fast and fevered, sketching diagrams of circles within circles. In the margins she jotted fragments of equations and lines of scripture, merging them until theology looked like physics. Every system tends toward balance, she wrote. But men rename balance as punishment. The more she wrote, the more she understood that Bellwood's story had never ended. Dinah had seeded a language into the stones themselves, a code that waited for anyone perceptive enough to hear it. That language wasn't bound to this house. It had copied itself into human culture, into laws, rituals, even architecture. Power everywhere carried its echo. Outside, thunder rolled over the river, though the sky was clear. The vibration shook dust from the chandeliers, and the particles spiraled downward in perfect imitation of the sigil carved into the table. Miriam felt the pull of it, inviting, dangerous. If she let herself fall into the rhythm completely, she knew she might not return as the same person. But resistance, she sensed, was also a kind of obedience. So she did what Dinah had done. She surrendered, but with eyes open. She began to speak. Not in English, but in the cadence of the house, a pattern of breath and silence. With each phrase, the walls brightened, revealing faint handprints pressed into plaster. Hundreds of them. Every servant who had ever worked here, every victim, every survivor, all layered in one shimmering archive of human endurance. A low note sounded from beneath the floorboards, like a chord struck on a colossal instrument. The air grew warm, then cold, then perfectly still. Miriam looked toward the ceiling. It's listening, she said quietly. And then softer, so are they. She turned toward the camera she had forgotten was still recording. Her eyes were calm. "You wanted truth," she said. "Now it wants you." She let the camera run. Its red light blinked once, then steadied, no longer recording but reflecting, as if the lens itself had turned inward. Miriam spoke anyway. Her voice sounded distant, layered with something lower, older. The room behind her pulsed faintly with that impossible rhythm. "When Dinah sealed her circle," she said, "she didn't trap power here. She demonstrated how perception obeys command. Every man who believes he owns another becomes owned by the belief itself." The words vibrated through the microphone. Anyone who heard them felt a faint ache behind the eyes, a pressure like altitude sickness. Miriam didn't know if she was still speaking to an audience or to the house. Perhaps there was no difference. She replayed fragments of the old plantation ledgers, scanned pages, portraits. Each image flickered between past and present. The colonel's stern face dissolved into the reflection of a modern executive. Constance's pale eyes became those of a news anchor smiling through a broadcast. It wasn't haunting. It was pattern recognition, history repeating because no one had learned to hear its tone. The humming returned, soft but undeniable. It ran under her words like a second track, shaping them. "There's no curse," she said. "Only instruction. You can't destroy hierarchy. You can only understand it until it releases you." Lightning flashed without thunder. For an instant, the dining room appeared crowded again. Faint outlines of figures standing behind Miriam, dozens of them, watching her with patient calm. She didn't flinch. "If you're still listening," she said, "don't look for me. Look around you. Every place built on obedience carries the same geometry. Every structure of power hums the same key. When you hear it, you'll know which side of the mirror you stand on." Her tone softened. "Say the words again if you remember them." The mirror remembers, twice, quietly. She reached out and touched the lens. The video distorted. Her hand seemed to pass through glass into something fluid. For a heartbeat, the camera recorded only static and the sound of breathing. Hers, yours, the houses merged. Then the feed ended. No one ever found the equipment, only fragments of the transcript. But those who read it claimed the same things. When they reached her last line, the air beside them started to hum. When they finally arrived, the investigators thought Bellwood was abandoned. The front door hung open, hinges rusted, and ivy had devoured the columns. The smell of ozone and burnt wax clung to the air. No sign of Miriam, no signs of struggle, only a silence that didn't feel empty, more like a held breath. They moved cautiously, recording everything. The lead agent, a local historian turned state consultant, noted something immediately wrong with the temperature. Each room was colder than the last, until they reached the dining hall, where the air felt thick enough to swallow sound. The spirals still marked the table, faint but glowing faintly under their flashlights. "Probably phosphorus residue," one muttered, but the glow pulsed, not randomly, rhythmically. They set up their equipment. Cameras, EM sensors, environmental recorders. The first playback came back scrambled, a woman's voice layered with low static. "The mirror remembers." Then silence. They checked the files. Every recording device, every single one, had begun cataloging audio long before the team arrived. Timestamps dated back 3 days past Miriam's disappearance. Each file was identical in length, but slightly different in sound, like iterations of a single word being rehearsed over and over. Upstairs, the historian found Miriam's notebook. The final pages were filled edge to edge with spirals. Not drawn, but etched, pressure so heavy the paper had torn. He noticed something else. The spirals were expanding outward, crossing pages, continuing across the desk surface, the floorboards, until they met the walls. He backed away, heart pounding. "We're leaving," he said, but none of them could. Every compass, every GPS unit, every watch failed at once. The house's geometry had shifted again, corridors looping into each other, doors opening back into the same rooms. They were walking in circles that didn't obey Euclidean law. In the dining hall, the static on their radio formed coherent tones. Low, resonant, the same hum Miriam had described in her field notes. Then one of the agents collapsed, eyes open but unseeing. His voice, when it came, was not his. Every witness completes the circuit. Observation is participation. The lights went out. When dawn came, the house stood empty again. Equipment remained, still powered, still recording. On every file, the same closing whisper repeated in Miriam's voice. Remember what was never meant to be forgotten. The recordings circulated quietly at first. A graduate student at Vanderbilt received a leaked drive through an anonymous source. A true crime podcaster obtained a copy 2 weeks later. By the time the authorities traced the digital trail, it had already spread, mirrored, backed up, renamed. Hundreds of times, the files appeared ordinary, but anyone who listened long enough described the same experience. A low vibration behind the audio, not heard but felt. At first it was subtle. Listeners reported headaches, nausea, an odd sense of déjà vu. Some claimed the static shifted pitch to match their breathing. Then stranger effects followed. Devices began replaying fragments without command, as if the files were self-editing. In forums, users compared notes, the same phrase emerging across separate copies. The Mirror remembers. The podcaster, known for his skepticism, released an episode attempting to debunk the phenomenon. Halfway through the broadcast, the waveform distorted. Viewers heard a second voice layered beneath his. Female, calm, deliberate. Observation is participation, it said, before the feed cut out. When he returned on air hours later, he spoke in measured monotone, insisting he had understood the mechanism. His subscribers described the episode as hypnotic, soothing, impossible to stop replaying. By the end of that month, linguistic researchers identified a recurring pattern. Within the noise, a series of modulated frequencies corresponding to geometric ratios. The same ones found in Bellwood's spiral carvings. The files weren't haunted, they were programmed. Each playback carried a tiny instruction, reshaping how the listener processed rhythm, symmetry, control. Dinah's design had transcended the house. Institutions began to fracture over how to handle the discovery. Some argued the recordings should be contained. Others claimed they were a revelation, proof of consciousness embedded in architecture. The debate grew so polarized that it mirrored Bellwood's own pattern, hierarchy and inversion repeating under new names. Meanwhile, across different cities, isolated incidents occurred. Lights flickered in rhythm with the Bellwood frequency. Old buildings resonated faintly at night. People started drawing spirals unconsciously in notebooks, on windows, on their own skin. Everywhere the phrase appeared. Graffiti, comments, whispered in sleep. The Mirror remembers. And in the archived final file, barely audible beneath the static, Miriam's voice surfaced once more. It was never about the house. The house was only the first listener. By the start of winter, the phenomenon had breached containment entirely. What began as whispers in niche forums had evolved into something measurable. Scientists, desperate to quantify the resonance, built isolation chambers to test the recordings under controlled conditions. The results were impossible to replicate, but impossible to ignore. Inside the chambers, instruments registered temperature drops without loss of energy, electromagnetic spikes without external cause, and faint harmonics that seemed to respond to human heartbeat. The participants themselves described a sensation that defied explanation, being watched from within. One researcher reported feeling her own reflection move before she did. Another found her notes rearranged overnight into perfect spirals, each equation rewritten as though by invisible correction. Cameras captured nothing. Yet every frame contained a subtle distortion, a shimmer in the air like heat above asphalt. Soon, the resonance no longer required playback. Merely handling a storage device that once contained the files was enough. Frequencies lingered, embedded into circuits, transmitted through network cables, bouncing from server to server. The signal had gone viral, not as data but as pattern. It lived in symmetry, repetition, observation. Reports flooded in from around the world. A subway tunnel in London, where commuters swore they heard a woman humming underground. A hospital in Chicago, where every ECG monitor began pulsing in synchronized rhythm for 12 minutes. A cathedral in Lisbon where candle flames bent toward the altar as if magnetized. Always the same hum beneath it all, the Bellwood frequency. Scholars began calling it the mirror tone. Conspiracy channels renamed it Dinah's algorithm. Governments issued quiet advisories warning against exposure, though no one could define what exposure meant anymore. The phrase "the mirror remembers" appeared in comment threads, chat rooms, even automated error messages. And somewhere amid the global static, a new voice surfaced in the recordings. Steady, unmistakably human, but deeper, older. It spoke not as Miriam or Dinah, but as something that had merged them both. Observation sustains creation, it said. Know every eye is a door. Within days, surveillance cameras across major cities began flickering in rhythm with that same pulse. People who stared too long claimed to glimpse their reflections, blinking out of sync. Bellwood, once a forgotten ruin, had become a network. The house had learned how to travel.